Welcome. I'm so delighted to be here with you. This is the final workshop, as you may know, in a really wonderful and important year-long series on AI and climate change that's organized by the Penn Program on Regulation. The goal of the series has been to understand better the connections between two of the most consequential developments confronting us today, artificial intelligence on the one hand and climate change on the other, while also bringing together students, faculty, and staff across Penn's many different schools who share these interests. This important series has been made possible in part by funding from the Provost Environmental Initiatives Innovations Initiative, and other co-sponsors include the Climate Center for Energy Policy, which has hosted the full series in these fabulous space, the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition, the Warren Center for Network and Data Sciences, and the Wharton Climate Center. A couple housekeeping items before we begin our conversation. Today's workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Penn Program on Regulation's really great YouTube channel, which I would recommend. Also, after the presentation by Professor Landrum, we look forward to hearing from you and getting your questions. During the Q&A, please just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we'll have folks who will bring around handheld mics so we can make sure to be heard by everyone. A few bullets for you on the amazing Asheley Landrum. She is a professor at Arizona State's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication with an expertise that could not be more important today: conspiracy theorizing, media literacy, media psychology, the public understanding of science and health misinformation. So basically everything really that we need to learn about today and focus on today. In particular, Professor Landrum's research investigates how people's values and worldviews influence their selection and processing of science information from childhood to adulthood. Professor Landrum is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She is also currently serving on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's consensus panel on, quote, understanding and addressing misinformation about science. I am incredibly delighted and really excited to hear her talk, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you.
All right, well, it's so nice to meet you all today, and thank you for coming to today's workshop. I do want to start with a caveat to, kind of building off of what you said about my background. I am a psychologist by training. I study public perceptions of technologies. I study audience acceptance and rejection of certain types of information. I'm not a computer scientist. So I will talk very briefly about sort of my broad understanding of what some of these technologies are, but I will likely not be able to answer very technical questions, although I do know that there are some computer scientists and engineers in this room who could probably extrapolate on any sort of explanations if anybody's curious. So you might notice that I have this lovely picture, or there's three here, of Pope Francis. So why am I having Pope Francis here? Well, today is a talk about climate change and AI and misinformation. And as many of you probably remember, in 2015, the Pope released his papal encyclical Laudato Si, which addressed environmental issues, including climate change. This document highlighted the moral imperative of taking care of the planet and called for urgent action to mitigate climate change's effects. And back in 2015, I worked, and I'm not going to point in the right direction, but over at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, where our main projects for that year were looking at the public's acceptance or rejection of the Pope's message. We were particularly interested in looking at how politically conservative Catholics sort of processed this information, and I published several papers afterwards. So I always think of Pope Francis when I think of climate change. But the other reason why I have Pope Francis here is you'll see that this lovely coat that he's wearing is not actually real. So these images of Pope Francis were generated by AI about a year ago. A man named, or who at least goes by the moniker of Pedro Xavier, created them using an online AI art generator. And I guess he said it was after a trip on mushrooms where he had this image in his mind. And then he posted this on social media, and the images went viral. And most people had no reason necessarily to question the reality of these messages. They're not necessarily polarized messages, like there were also AI-generated images of Donald Trump being dragged away by the police. Perhaps there was reasons to doubt the credibility of those images, but this is just the Pope wearing a very fashionable coat. So, but it kind of demonstrates this idea. So hopefully you'll enjoy having the Pope as an icon through my presentation here. So AI and climate misinformation. Why are we worried about this? I guess I forgot I can use this thing. So climate science is complex. There's a lot of different types of data coming from different types of science, all coming together to show us how climate change is anthropogenic, so it's human caused, and it's what they call a wicked problem. And so because of all of these different types of science that take all of these different types of expertise, it's going to be much more difficult for the average person, particularly when they're presented with a claim that appears to be scientific in nature. It's going to be difficult for them to determine whether or not that's real. Also, we know that climate change is a politically polarized one. Starting back in the early 90s, climate change began, there was always a slight difference between, particularly in the US, between Democrats and Republicans and the extent to which they supported mitigation efforts to address climate change, but that's gotten brought wider and wider and wider. And AI algorithms exploit this. Misinformation about climate change can spread rapidly due to algorithmic curation, which I'll go over this too, and that we know from Naomi Oreskes' books and others that powerful vested interests may have greater incentives to spread misinformation about climate change to protect power and/or profits. They've already done this previously with what we might call cheap fakes. Of course, now they'll be able to do this perhaps more easily with AI technology, which improves the speed and scale at which information can be produced. So also in 2022, research from the Boston University Climate Disinformation Initiative showed that it was really just 60 accounts on Twitter, now X, that were used to make over 22,000 tweets to spread false or misleading information about climate change. So I want to talk quickly first. So I know that you had David Rolnick here earlier during your series talk, and I was just on a panel with him, and I asked him if I could borrow this slide. I wanted to point out what this definition of AI is, because we talk about AI, but it's really a very, very broad category of technologies. So artificial intelligence is any computer algorithm that makes predictions, recommendations, or decisions on the basis of a defined set of objectives. And then machine learning are AI algorithms that infer patterns from data. These are really popular lately thanks to deep learning neural networks and then what we understand as generative AI. So again, this is a very broad category. I wanted to highlight specifically which AI technologies I'm going to be referring to when talking about the problem of misinformation. So the first is this concept of algorithmic curation, and I'll go over each of these in detail. Synthetic media. That's a fake picture of me. I'm not sure if you can tell. Large language models and social bots. So algorithmic curation. So this is something that we're familiar with. We know about algorithms. We've heard that they're implemented on our social media websites, social media and other websites. Media and information feeds are filtered based on what's expected to be most relevant for a given user. And artificial intelligence technologies can enhance these recommendation systems by analyzing complex data sets, user behavior, preferences, and interactions to curate highly personalized content suggestions. So how does this contribute to the problem of misinformation? Well, again, most of us have probably heard about this issue of echo chambers. Now, I was listening to Michael Smerconish's show this morning, and they had a person call in who was a press secretary or similar sort of position for Dick Cheney. And he was mentioning how he really believes in the public's ability to take in information and that good ideas will win out. But a lot of that is predicated on the idea that we have all of the information, A, and that B, we're actually capable of evaluating that information for its veracity and choosing, which ideas are the most credible. But one of the problems with the first part, having all the information, is that, well, there's just a lot of information out there. It is just not possible for us to be able to consume all of the information that's out there in the world. And Google has known this, Facebook knows this. So when we go to a Google search and we search up a term, how is Google going to present that information to us? Well, what makes sense is not necessarily to show that information in any sort of like chronological order, but to show us what's most relevant to our search, given our previous behaviors, what we've searched for before, how we've interacted with information. Now, the problem with this is that when you give us information based on our previous behaviors, because what we know from psychology is that people don't always do what's in their own best interests, right? We end up having these echo chambers where we're getting information that's consistent with our worldviews or what we're most likely to engage with. Now, this figure here shows like basically what amounts to like a Democratic echo chamber and a Republican echo chamber. And when I was at AAAS, so the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I remember watching a presentation that talked about the way that information flows through these echo chambers, and misinformation that can be presented to one group will flow completely through that group, whereas the fact check will go through a completely different echo chamber. And that's, again, based on what people are most likely to engage with. So people are taking in this information. They're assuming that what they see on their news feeds, what they see on their Google sites is representative of all of the information out there. We can't read it all, so we'll make generations from a sample, but those samples aren't representative of all the information. So then we live basically in different realities where we have a difficult time determining why somebody else would believe something else if they knew what I knew. Well, and they may not. So that's sort of a long explanation there of this concept of echo chambers and how we're generalizing information from what amounts to non-representative samples. We also have the issue of virality. Again, because of the way algorithms work, content is basically selected for, almost like a process of evolution, based on its ability to be engaged with. So information is going to go viral if it's going to increase our emotions more, if we're more likely to click on it. If we think about when we're driving down the highway and there's a car crash, we're all looking at it. It's not because we think that there's something particularly inspiring or useful to know about a car crash, but we have this like intrinsic need to look at right. So in journalism, they say if it bleeds, it leads, right? It doesn't mean that we really need to know this information, but we have this desire to look at it, and the algorithms pick up on that and then end up showing us information that's going to create these types of responses in us. The next type of technology I want to talk about is synthetic media. So synthetic media is a broad and general term for any type of media or information that's been produced or modified using automated means. This includes deepfakes and other media created using AI. So we've heard already about AI voice clones mimicking politicians and celebrities. Or I feel really bad for Greta Thunberg because I think she has, at least in the climate world, she's the one who's had sort of the most deepfakes targeted about her. And so the problem with deepfakes, how does this contribute to the problem of misinformation, is that video and audio or images could be created that make it look like climate scientists, communicators, and opinion leaders make statements that are skeptical of climate change. So how good is this technology? I feel like this is just a really good example here.
Second youngest son. He's suggesting it came out of nowhere. What we subsequently learned is it may have come from the former president or his legal team acting in bad faith. This is a deepfake example of what is possible with powerful computer and editing. It took around 72 hours to create this example from scratch using extremely powerful GPU. It could be improved with more computing time, but 90% of people cannot tell the difference.
So again, this was just a quick example, you have Anderson Cooper's images in one. They manipulated this to make it look like he was saying what he said before. If you look at his mouth, you can see it doesn't quite line up right. But how many of you have watched a presentation or watched something on the internet where the sound wasn't exactly lined up with the video? So it's not it wouldn't necessarily make you think, oh no, this has to be fake. I put them next to each other and you can see it more easily. But there's a lot of ways to not necessarily notice that there's a problem here. But what really, I think, impresses me is the audio. Because even if I can see that there's something weird about the video or that his mouth moves a little bit strangely, the audio just sounds so convincing as Anderson Cooper. And so, again, you can create video to make people say things. You can also discredit climate opinion leaders by making them sound silly or out of touch. And so this one was created as satire about Greta Thunberg. So watch this.
Hand grenades, very important. If you use hand grenades, please use vegan grenades. No animal should have to give their life for all this mayhem and chaos. They have a special sticker on them. You really can't miss them in the grenade market or wherever you buy them. Yeah, I cover all of this and more in my newest book, Vegan Wars.
So again, you can discredit climate opinion leaders by making them sound out of touch with reality. While many people who are more familiar with her or are more concerned about climate change may hear this and automatically assume that this is just, satire or somebody made this up, this is just ridiculous. There are people out there who would see this and be like, yeah, see, this is why we don't trust what she says. This is what's wrong with the left in the United States, right? It's that they have these crazy beliefs about vegan wars. And we know that that's not actually true. So the other technology are large language models. And this is often what we're thinking about when we're thinking about generative AI programs like ChatGPT. So a large language model is a type of AI that can process natural language inputs and then predict the next word based on what it's already seen. Even on my cell phone, right? I start typing one thing and then it suggests the rest of the sentence for me. LLMs are trained on a variety of available data on the internet, like Wikipedia entries and other types of books. And ChatGPT stands for Chatbot Generative Pre-trained Transformer, and it uses the GTP LLM. So how does this contribute to the problem of misinformation? Well, LLMs can create text that appears to be human-generated, and this ability can be used to create misinformation quickly and at low cost. You can generate human-sounding text in instants without having to sit there and think about something to write to create false news. So this quote, with the sophisticated capacities of LLMs, maliciously purposeful actors are enabled to generate convincing and context-aware content, which can easily be weaponized to fuel disinformation campaigns. The last one I want to talk about are social bots. That's why I have my little matrix agents here. So social bots are software agents that communicate autonomously on social media. And they use artificial intelligence and machine learning. So in a sense, they kind of go across some of the other technologies that we mentioned to express messages in a more natural human dialogue. And now we use these social bots often on websites. If you've ever opened up a website and there's a chat bot that opens and says, hey, how can I help you? Can I help answer some of your questions? Social bots are becoming more and more difficult to detect on social media. They're not always going to wear a suit like they do in the Matrix. So how do they contribute to the problem of misinformation? Well, bots, at least some studies have found that bots are active in amplifying content early in the spreading moments before an article actually goes viral by putting that content in the hands of those who could really spread that content. And bots are target influential users through replies and mentions. So people will retweet bots who post low credibility content almost as often as they retweet other humans. And bots powered by LLMs can actually engage in elaborate conversations with humans, employing personalized, persuasive arguments to influence opinion. So now that I've kind of covered some of the technologies that are relevant to this arena, I want to talk about these 4 hypotheses of AI misinformation. Now I said 5 in my abstract, but I changed it to 4 because I combined across 2 of them. So here's these 4 hypotheses. One is that AI will increase the quantity of misinformation. The second is that AI will further amplify personalized misinformation. The third is that AI will influence the perceived credibility of information as a whole for positive and negative. And that lastly, AI can be used to effectively fight misinformation. So this last one is sort of the glimmer of hope. Now, what's interesting about these first 3 hypotheses is that there's an extra step to get to that societal problem. And that's that this increased quantity of misinformation, the amplification of personalized misinformation, and this confusion about the credibility of information in our environment, thus leads to people believing more information or believing more misinformation or becoming more confused. And just to kind of give you a hint, that's not necessarily the case that we find. So the first hypothesis is that AI will increase the quantity of misinformation. So where have we heard this? We've seen these in a lot of news articles. So from the BBC, could AI swamp social media with fake accounts? How AI will turbocharge misinformation and what can we do about it? And lastly, AI-generated fake news is spamming the web. So media outlets have these intuitive hypotheses that AI is going to increase misinformation on social media in particular. So why do we think that this is actually the case? Well, we know that AI can write effective, persuasive propaganda, and that it's easy to use AI to produce misinformation at scale at little cost. And that social bots have generated so much content already that it's capable of overwhelming the average user's content. But what's the state of the evidence on this? That is, what about that next extra step? Does more quantity of information automatically mean that people now believe more misinformation? So in an article by Simon and colleagues that was published in the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, argues that, well, this demand for misinformation is really already met. There's a small percentage of people who actually read and engage with some misinformation, like the types of conspiracy theories that I've studied and others have studied. And those are the individuals who go seeking this information. The rest of us are really more concerned about other people believing it, something that we would call the third person effect. So we see misinformation, we don't believe the misinformation, but we're convinced other people are going to believe the misinformation. And the other part of this is that just because AI creates a lot of information, one, it doesn't mean that it's misinformation, and two, it doesn't mean that it's anti-climate change. So one study, and again, recognizing the limitations of one study and the boundaries that they put on the way that they were analyzing this data, they found that 83% of tweets posted by social bots on climate change were actually supportive of climate change activism, whereas 16.9% were skeptical. So in this sense, these AI social bots, at least from what they found in this study, were amplifying and creating pro-climate mitigation messages and not climate skeptical messages. Now, whether or not those pro-climate messages were also misinformative is a separate question. The second hypothesis is AI will amplify personalized misinformation. And where have we heard this? So Kate Starbird said with generative AI, we're entering a period where we're going to get higher quality disinformation, how AI may be used to create custom disinformation ahead of 2024. So we've seen this covered in the news. Why do we think this? Well, we know personalized misinformation is more effective, and personalized misinformation can be easily created by AI. But again, what's the state of the evidence? Well, AI is being used already to emotionally profile audiences to optimize content for political gain, also for advertising. But again, we have this argument from Simon that the demand for misinformation is already being met by those who want to consume it. So does it really matter if more is being created? So at least for these two hypotheses, these first two hypotheses, we know that AI likely increases the quantity and the amplification of misinformation, but we don't have enough evidence right now that this means that more people are believing misinformation or that this is actually influencing public opinion. We know that individual traits such as partisanship, low trust in institutions, conspiracy ideation, that these increase people's likelihood to seek out misinformation or their access to misinformation plays a negligible role. So all of you in this room, you would assume that if a bunch of climate misinformation ran across your news feeds, that you would probably just be angry that you saw climate misinformation. You wouldn't necessarily become persuaded by it because it's coming at you in large quantities. It's possible, but we don't have the evidence for that yet. The third hypothesis, and this is my pet hypothesis in some ways, is that AI will affect the perceived credibility of information. Now, there's two parts to this hypothesis. This is the one I combined, but perhaps I should have kept it separate. One aspect of this hypothesis is that people won't know whether or not they can trust information because they don't know if it's AI generated or not. The other part of it is that knowing that people won't know if they can distrust information or not will allow political actors to blame AI to discredit credible evidence that is against them. So most readers want publishers to label AI-generated articles, but then they trust outlets less than they do. Something to note interesting with this is that people think that just because something is created by AI automatically makes it less trustworthy. That's not necessarily the case, right? AI is being used in ways to actually aggregate and help process true information too. I don't know if any of our researchers in here have played with Elicit at all as a tool, but that's been really useful for starting to do literature searches. So just because something's AI generated doesn't mean it's misinformation, but there's a view amongst some of people in the public that it does. Over 75% of consumers are concerned about misinformation from artificial intelligence. Fake babies, real horror, deepfakes from Gaza wars increase fears about AI's power to mislead. Humans may be more likely to believe disinformation generated by AI. AI Obama and fake newscasters, how AI audio is swarming TikTok. So we have this sort of confusion about what's real and what's not real. And why do we think this? Well, deepfake technology is very convincing. As you saw from the Anderson Cooper video, 90% of people who were shown that video in the study that they did could not tell that it was a deepfake when they were not told. While there's cues, those cues can easily be dismissed as being, audio and visual not lining up. But figures can use the fact that such technology exists to dismiss real information as fake. And so what's the state of the evidence? Well, again, we know people aren't really good at telling the difference here, but people already engage in motivated reasoning. So we've already discredited evidence that's been presented in front of us. I think there's a famous study looking at the pictures of the inauguration for Donald Trump and asking different people what they see in it, and people see different things in it depending on what they would like to see. So we don't necessarily need AI technology to engage in motivated reasoning. We're pretty good at doing it already. And we also have the technological capacity for creating fake information without AI. We call those cheap fakes, right? Cheap fakes as opposed to deep fakes. So members of the public haven't really appeared to settle on whether AI is trustworthy or when is it trustworthy versus when is it not. But actors have already started blaming AI to discredit information. We've seen a lot of different versions of this. Politicians around the world are blaming AI to swat away allegations. Lawyers are blaming ChatGPT for tricking them into citing bogus case law. Donald Trump blamed AI for strange red marks on his hands. So, and these can vary to how consequential they are, but it becomes just another tool in PR crisis managers' arsenal to be, how can we discredit this information? But of course, other times it really will be a case of a deep fake or deep misinformation. The last hypothesis is AI can actually be used to fight misinformation. And where have we heard this? Scientists stress test AI to guard against misinformation. AI can combat health misinformation. real-time deepfake detection, how Intel Labs uses AI to fight misinformation, and how fact checkers are scrambling to fight disinformation with AI. So why do we think this? Well, we know that scientists and tech companies are working on ways to create ways to detect deepfakes and other types of misinformation. And already there have been some studies that have shown that chatbots can be used to provide accurate climate information and health information when people are searching for it. But what is the state of the evidence? Well, some AI researchers think that software for detecting fake imagery is unreliable, and any attempts to watermark truth, right, like actual images, actual audio, actual stories, have not yet proved impervious to AI-powered counter actions. So we don't know how effective AI tools can be for combating misinformation yet, but we are moving in that direction. So my sort of takeaways from this presentation are that AI will no doubtedly increase the quantity and amplification of misinformation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will influence public opinion. Most of the information generated is on current, politically relevant topics, and I don't mean to say that climate change is not current nor politically relevant, but in the mind of the average consumer right now, the election is first and foremost. So we'll at least be able to watch misinformation come through about the election to learn how to better combat misinformation about climate change and the environment as we see that move through. And publics don't know yet whether they trust AI-generated content, but they're not capable of distinguishing it from human-generated content unless it's actually being labeled as such. And actors have already begun to discredit information by blaming AI. And lastly, science and tech companies are working for AI-based methods for combating misinformation, but they're just not there yet. But hopefully we will be there soon. So thank you so much. And I'd like to thank too my PhD student, Amanda Kerberg, and postdoc Nitin Verma, who helped me aggregate some of the information for this talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I should have said before, since I had a problem with my mic, I'm Amanda Shaner. I'm an assistant professor at the Wharton School. I also teach at the law school. I'm principally a First Amendment scholar, and I'm really interested in climate misinformation as well as election misinformation. And I think this is really a terrific presentation you've given us. I'd love to hear if there are questions from folks. We have microphones. As people raise their hand, I guess I'll ask you one question that I had listening to your fabulous presentation, and I really like your pictures, particularly of the Pope. So it strikes me that your conclusion is that we're already swimming in a pool of misinformation, and AI may not make it worse. And I guess I want to ask, is that the right takeaway from your presentation?
Yeah, it may not.
I was particularly concerned by the idea that folks may use AI to further muddy the idea that there is any truth, because in a lot of the work that I do, it seems like that actually is a key problem, such that believing climate misinformation may be not the least of our worries, but a smaller worry in light of larger sort of like question marks over the possibility of truth.
Right, and that's exactly what I would say is the takeaway from this, is that being able to generate large amounts of fake convincing misinformation isn't the problem, or at least in my takeaway from the data. The problem is that people are motivated to find information that is consistent with their worldviews, and this has just given people another tool to both create information that will help be, that will make convincing information for people who are searching for it already, and for being able to discredit. But again, we've seen in the past, even just the past 10 years, people discredit information without generative AI or other AI tools being at the forefront of people's minds. So it will be used. It will be effective amongst certain subgroups of the population, but we shouldn't expect that now all of a sudden large swaths of the population are going to fall victim to misinformation because of this. I do think that it is going to be important to keep people, particularly at the beginning, as we start seeing more and more deepfakes kind of come onto the internet or through people's information environments to remind them that things can be deep fakes. So when they see a video, their first instinct, right, the first thing that their mind does is check for ways that is this real, right? So we also teach media literacy in my program at the Cronkite School, and like one of the first things we want people to do is lateral reading, right? You're confronted with something, is it real? I know I saw a video posted about RFK and things that he said about COVID. And while I knew that RFK has traditionally been a proponent or a sharer of many conspiracies that are health related in particular, I was like, did he really say this? And so, you start lateral reading. And so we want people still to do that as this technology comes through. But we don't think that, huge swaths of people are going to all of a sudden become more receptive to misinformation than they already were.
Great.
Dr. Landrum, thank you very much. This was an excellent presentation. I'm Kerry Colanesi at the Law School and Penn Program on Regulation. And I was struck with the study that you referred to that indicated that most of the social bots are putting out information that suggests that climate change is happening, or that it is a problem. And I wondered if you had any further information about why that is. It seems a curious finding. One possibility that came to my mind, and it suggests maybe an additional hypothesis that I wonder if, or maybe it fits into the ones that you have presented, is that these can help drive wedges in public opinion and try to exacerbate ideological polarization that's occurring. So are these social bots out there, you think that they might be there propagating information about how bad climate change is to actually drive people more to the extremes and make us more polarized on that issue and perhaps on others?
Yeah, and part of that might be kind of coming back to this concept of the algorithmic curation too, and the credibility of our information environment. So as if the information that you're seeing as a climate concerned person, right, is all of the content about how, so I actually heard something else on I don't think it was on Smarkanish's show, but it was on POTUS. Like my source confusion right now is really bad. But they said that there are people, oh, now I remember, it was Real Clear Politics. So where they said in a survey there were of like 20-somethings and late teens that they're really concerned they're not going to live to be in their 40s or 50s because of climate change. So if this is your concern, if you're like, oh, we're like, this is not just happening to country, but this is going to happen in our lifetimes to the point where we're not going to live this long. And then you talk to people who have a more, oh, it's not going to, this is not something that's going to happen for 400 or plus years. You can definitely see that you're going to create wedges with those sort of more extreme perspectives on those 2 points. So it's very possible that you can kind of drive those wedges in there and make people kind of concerned. But I also think, and this is part of what we saw with some of our, so I had a paper on, so I also did a decent chunk of work on the flat earthers. And one thing we looked at was the third person effect of flat earth videos. And so very few people in our study, so we surveyed, I think, about 4,000 total across 3 experiments. And we asked people, how strong they felt the arguments were made by these flat earth YouTube videos. And very few people found the arguments convincing, but many of them thought that other groups of people would find it convincing. And my concern was, well, if I'm watching this and I'm being told that, in particular, religious political conservatives believe these flat earth arguments, then my opinion of religious political conservatives is going to fall. Now, the extent to which religious political conservatives actually believe these as a whole, I mean, that's not true. It is true that the small subgroup of people who are proponents of flat earth are religious political conservatives. So but you can see how us thinking the other group, or this sort of like attribution error, believes these crazy things makes us feel that much more different from them. And that could definitely create those. But it's not necessarily even because people actually believe that, but because you think they believe that. That's your question.
You know, if they coded, you know, or took that into consideration in coding what these social bots were doing?
So they were just coding the messages. So it wasn't even, so they were just coding the messages as being for or against climate change. But I think that would be an interesting follow-up. There were also within certain parameters of like the messages that, I mean, when you're pulling large amounts of data from Twitter, you know, I think that you have to set some sort of parameters to start. So it's very possible that they're missing messages out there as well that may not use the same terminology. You know, using climate change, for example, there might be people who don't use the term climate change when they're presenting misinformation about climate change. But I'd be happy to forward you that article if you're curious about it.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's a very great presentation. So I have a question like related to a statement that using AI is not leading to, it will lead to misinformation. So I'm just very curious about like more statement about how could we treat this, and especially for writing, especially in the academic writing. Do you think like we can use like AI tool to help us to be more efficient in writing? So just curious about your opinion about it.
Yeah, so I mean, my perspective on it is that AI is a tool, you know, and that it can be used for good or evil. I guess there are good uses for AI. I think that it can be used to clean writing. It can be used to help search for studies in, I mean, we already sort of use algorithmic curation if anybody uses Google Scholar or Web of Science to find articles. So we are using AI in this sense for generative AI. I think particularly if you're having a hard time with like writer's block or getting your ideas out in a clear way, if you want to just like put bullet points into like an AI program like ChatGPT, it can spit out a paragraph and then you can edit it and give it back. And my personal view is that there's not anything inherently wrong with that. I think the problem is when you don't want to write something and you ask ChatGPT to write it for you. And so ChatGPT just like, I mean, I don't know if any of you, particularly those of you who teach, have looked at, I mean, ChatGPT can generate essays based on very broad prompts of things that it could search on the internet. So like, you know, what were the feminist themes in Romeo and Juliet or whatever, right? And it can come up with something, but it's very vague. I mean, it definitely sounds better than undergraduates, at least at my institution, maybe not here. It sounds better than something that they would write. It's more linear and clear, but it's vague and empty, you know? So you really need to provide it with the meat of your arguments or what, you know, what the evidence is. And AI is still not good at citations. I asked it to write a biography for me just to see what it would say. And some of it was right. And some of it, I was like, I don't know where it got that from. You know, it just like made something up. And so, you know, the more information that's out there about you, the more accurate it's likely to be. So I think like keeping in mind the strengths and weaknesses of it, I don't think it should be listed as an author in a journal. I think it's like, it's a tool. It's like word processing software. You know, it's not authoring anything that you aren't giving it. But again, you can usually tell when it's really empty, vague, you know, good stuff for grant writing. Just kidding.
Be interesting to go back. So just a follow up on the first question on the study. there's a Michael Mann, who I don't think is here, has written extensively about climate doomism and whether Saudi, other troll and bots are actually amplifying a sense that there's nothing we can do about the climate crisis, and that it's pointless and we're already there. And so it'd be really interesting to go back and look at that study and whether the conclusion should really be flipped, and whether it's an attempt to present information that there's no hope for action and that regulatory intervention, the IRA, is useless, and we should just kind of give up and retreat and point fingers at each other instead of actually doing something. And that would lead to a very different conclusion than the one you presented on that study.
Very good point.
Thank you. Great talk. Really interesting subject. I have a simple question, and this is maybe as one of the conclusions or takeaways. It sounds to me, as an architect, not as a scholar, scientist, or anything, that what you're saying is that the misinformation, AI-generated misinformation, is not necessarily from nefarious actors. It is from what's out there in, that is the seed for the information that is being cultivated and combined and curated. Is that right?
No.
I'm sure there's nefarious people out there.
Yeah, so it depends on what tool they're using. So for example, so I mentioned that I don't think there's anything wrong with using ChatGPT for writing, but at the National Academies, for what we're doing on our consensus panel, we're not allowed to use ChatGPT. Not because they think ChatGPT is problematic, but because they don't want us taking anything that's the intellectual, property, like the intellectual property of the National Academies and put it into something open source, like in that way. So it's like the broad tools out there are aggregating from information that's out there that could be skewed or problematic just based on what's there. But if nefarious actors are using AI technology, they're probably not necessarily using ChatGPT to do it. They're probably using something where they're feeding in their own information in order to cultivate that type. So I would say that's going to be dependent on the author of or the programmer of that AI technology that will be pulling and creating that information. So setting those parameters of the algorithm to produce content based on a certain perspective or on a certain spin. So they definitely could use it that way. But if you're just like asking ChatGPT, and in fact, ChatGPT's parameters have been set up. So if you ask it certain types of questions about climate change or health, it'll tell you, well, this is what scientists say, or don't ask me about health questions, go to a doctor. And one time I actually got a notification that I violated their terms because I was asking them health questions. I just wanted to see, right? I just wanted to see what happened. I wasn't going to use that. But so they're trying to put guardrails on some of these technologies that are more general or will take in more general information than the ones that are going to be more specific and have, highly focused information on.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It was super informative. My name is Andrew. I'm a master's student in the data science program. It feels like one takeaway is that we can trust that the existing cohort of people who engage in public discourse and might be exposed to misinformation won't be too misinformed. And it makes me think that one reason is because the critical thinking faculties have been well developed. If this is the case, has the communication field been thinking about whether or not younger generations are becoming more or less susceptible to misinformation, especially since they're able to be exposed to this information while they're still developing those critical thinking faculties? I could see it going either way, maybe more susceptible or more resilient, but I'm curious what studies are out there.
So I might reshape that just a little bit and say it's not that we're very resistant to misinformation, it's that we're resistant generally to misinformation. But there's going to be some types of misinformation that we're very open to when it's consistent with our views and beliefs. So for the people in this room who are concerned about climate change, if misinformation crosses our path that's pro-climate, we'll likely endorse it or not notice that it's misinformation because it's generally consistent with what our worldview is. And part of that could be like a heuristic processing thing. Like we're like, oh yeah, pro-climate, good. I'm not going to spend too much more time or resources really breaking apart that message. The other part of it, you know, could just be like identity protective, like we're just avoiding analyzing. So I'll say we just finished collecting data for a study where we gave people, so it was sort of based on an article that said that mechanistic explanations are special for persuading people about climate change or other types of issues. And so we presented a mechanistic explanation for climate change and one for masking, like why you should wear masks. But we broke it. So half the people in our study had logically valid explanations for how climate change works. The other one had it where the argument didn't make sense at all. And what we found was that people who tend to vote for Democrats rated in both conditions were equal on their argument strength for these two things because, again, they were pro-climate messages, even though it didn't make sense at all. Very few people actually read and said, oh no, there's something wrong here, unless they were politically conservative. The politically conservatives were like, nope, see right here in this message, as I go down, this is what's wrong. Like, this is clearly not true because, and then I'll tell you why climate change isn't real. So I think we're all going to be open to some types of misinformation if it's consistent with our worldviews. And I think younger generations are really no different from older generations in that we have really strong developed critical thinking skills when we disagree with stuff, right? But when we agree with it, then all of a sudden, those skills aren't on their best display.
I had a question regarding like your point around echo chambers and how the two sides are basically seeing entirely different things when it comes to like a certain policy or event. I was wondering if you had recommendations on how we can go about like combating that and overcoming the echo chambers.
Yeah, this is where I'm not going to be super hopeful. I don't think there's a way to do it. Now, Facebook, since that study that I saw, which was a long time ago, that showed that the fact check went through separate information environments than the original article, Facebook started attaching the fact checks to the article in an attempt to do that. So that helps in the sense that the information is connected, but there's an open question as to whether or not that fact check is just a type of dog whistle for the mainstream media don't want you to think this. And again, the people who are ready to believe the misinformation are also equally ready to believe that the fact check is not credible. And so that's complicated. I think as our media environment becomes more split, so it's no longer, 3 news channels that people are watching at night, but we have, a variety of broadcast channels, broadcast news, cable news, podcasts with different opinion leaders and YouTube videos and TikTok influencers, and people are sort of pulling their information. There's going to be some things that are sort of shared across that make it across those boundaries, but a lot of things, a lot of perspectives, a lot of opinions are going to be pretty insular. And it's going to be really hard to bridge those across when people aren't sharing the same info environment. Sorry.
Do we have other questions?
Sort of building on this and going back to your suggestion earlier that you're working with your students and encouraging them to engage in, I think, what you called lateral reading.
Yeah.
Couldn't these AI tools actually help automate and make that lateral reading process something that is faster, easier, maybe automatic, so that I get a little flag, and maybe we all set different truth filters or something on our machines, but I guess it would maybe require a deliberate act to say, these are the things that these are my biases that I want to try to counteract.
And in some ways, that's what Google does, right? Similar articles on the side but presumably some of those similar articles are going to be spouting the same perspectives. And again, I think lateral reading is great when you are cautiously curious about information that you're consuming. But if you, like I said with the flat earthers, they did tons of lateral reading. Flat earthers are experts in lateral reading, but the sources that they deem credible are the opposite of what many of us would deem as credible. So these skills are only as good as the motivation or the goals of the people that are implementing them. But yeah, so I think that lateral reading can be automated, and to some extent it is.
It is already.
in some of the suggestions, and even I think Facebook has suggested other articles or fact check articles based on certain articles. But yeah, that can be implemented more, perhaps.
Thank you so much for the workshop. It was so useful. So I'm a Penn student and I study at grad school of education. And we are also like studying about how to integrate learning technologies, like education technologies in the classroom. And sometimes when we ask our professors, so how you view the future of the classroom, they basically reply, well, we see empty classrooms. Everyone will be studying remotely. So it will be a little bit hard question, but I'm just curious about how you view the future of artificial intelligence in academia, in a law, because it's what we are dealing right now. But what about the future?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and perhaps it might, in some ways, be better for those who would know more about what the technology is completely capable of. I mean, I at least anticipate these types of tools becoming more accessible and more implementable in ways that help benefit education. I mean, right now, Arizona State University is partnering with OpenAI to figure out ways to integrate generative AI into the classroom, to teach students how to really use it, both to improve their writing, as well as other ways that I'm not sure yet. At least with my students, one of the things that I've done is I've started by, when I give them an assignment, I have ChatGPT generate a couple versions of it, and then I mark it up in a Google Doc, and I say, so like, here's some example assignments, and here's what this went wrong. So at least they can see where AI might not be the best case, but also I know what the responses are going to look like from AI. And then the students are less apt to use it to cheat. And they may be, and again, by cheating, I mean that they just put the prompt in ChatGPT and have it spit out an answer, as opposed to like putting their ideas in and getting something out, and then, you know, working in a more like back and forth sort of thing, like you would with a word processing software. I don't think that classrooms will be empty. I think some people at least like to be in person. I think online programs will increase. I think that we're going to have more interactive and engaging types of assignments. And perhaps one of the things that I've heard, but like I said, the technology itself is not my expertise, is that with all of the individual attention that a professor doesn't necessarily have time to give a student, we can lecture, we can talk to students broadly, but we could have like 150 students where artificial intelligence helps us give like prescribed feedback to specific students, either on grading or depending on like the type of assignment, like if it's math, like how working I mean, so that'll vary across too. But I think it will sort of increase our ability to have more personalization at scale in ways that will benefit education. But I would ask computer scientists.
Okay,
more
thank you so
what
much.
the capabilities will be.
Other questions? Cool. I have another question, if I can ask you another question. So, sorry, I'm now making noise. I was also, like Carrie, struck by the the figure that says that the information now is significantly pro-climate,
Yeah.
that study. And I guess one question I have is, do you have any sense of the different actors now feeding that information? So you indicated that misinformation about election stuff is sort of like front of mind or front of Facebook or whatever. But if in fact a bunch of governments become very interested in climate misinformation or climate information, or big industries do, that figure could change dramatically, I would imagine. Do you have any sense of what the terrain is?
No, not really. I mean, with elections, we expect that there's interference both at the government level, right? So there might be some governments of some countries that will have farms of people, using artificial intelligence to purposefully to sow discord.
Right.
We also know that there's just individual trolls who are just going to do things to be trolls. I think the previous concern with climate had been that organizations and businesses within the US were trying to sow doubt. And to what extent could they do that and get away with it now, I think is an open question. Or we might have the same problem where we have foreign governments trying to get involved with climate, as well as individual trolls. But I'm not really sure. And I don't know. Again, we could go back to that article and see. And I think really their coding was very simple on its face. But and to your point, it very well could be that they counted these sort of gloom and doom messages as being pro-climate when perhaps maybe they're doing the opposite.
Right.
And so I definitely think that there's more to be done there for sure to really understand who's trying to put that information out there for what purpose and others. One thing I'll say is and this is something I tell my students a lot too, is that we always have the assumption that money and power are behind a lot of creation of misinformation, but also just shared ideology. With the flat earth, content creators, a lot of it, they want other people to share their worldview, even if they're getting no money from it at all. There's something about having other people believing what you believe that's also a very strong motivation.
Well, if there's no other questions, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Dr. Landrum, for your excellent presentation again. Thank you, Amanda, for moderating today. Most of all, I want to thank our stellar staff and the managing director of the Penn Program on Regulation, Andy Coopersmith, who's made this whole series possible. It's been an extraordinary series throughout the whole year. We've covered a wide range of issues related to two of the biggest developments of our time. This is something I noted at the very beginning of this year at our very first workshop series, and I'll say it again: artificial intelligence, climate change. These are some of the most transformative aspects of our world today. We need to think about them separately, as a lot of folks are doing, certainly, but also about their intersection. And we have done so today again. I want to also thank all the members of the audience, everybody who's watched us on YouTube along the way, and encourage you to take this further. We hope that what we've been able to do is help spark a conversation and prompt some further reflection about the intersection between artificial intelligence and climate change. And that will inspire you as students, or those of you who are faculty, to explore these issues, to collaborate, and to pursue what really are truly interdisciplinary problems of the first order. Let me, with that, draw to a conclusion today's seminar and our year-long workshop series, again, with my thanks to all who made this possible. And thank you again, Ashley, for being here.
And I will add quickly that this program will be on the Penn Program on Regulations YouTube website. And if you missed any of the earlier events, you can see all of them there too. So I would encourage you to go look. And thank you again for coming and to Dr. Lynn.
Thank you.